First, forgive me if I take this opportunity, because she's overseas with our daughters, to wish a happy birthday to my good wife, Gayatri. She will be on the show later. Thank you, Gayatri, for everything. You brought sunshine on Leith into my life. And I want to remember the death of our good friend Gonzalo Lira, who we thought was dead and buried as a story, but who has now become the subject of major international discourse and maybe a very significant role in what happens next in Ukraine. Gonzalo Lira was a good friend of ours, and we were amongst the very few good friends of his. People rubbished him, people doubted him, but we always trusted him. And we featured him over and over and over again on the mother of all talk shows. And in fact, he remains the biggest view count of any of our guests. That's how significant a man he was to this show and to the international audience that saw right from the start 3 years ago that all was not what we were being told it was in the battle in Ukraine. Gonzalo Lira was murdered by President Zelensky. When he was asked that today by a journalist, he laughed. But he may not be laughing for long, because the Vice President of the United States is now highlighting how it came to be that an American citizen, a journalist, a blogger, was able to be incarcerated, tortured, and murdered by the United States' closest ally, to whom the United States was giving hundreds of billions of dollars. More of that later. How it came to pass that Joe Biden's embassy in Kiev did jack shit to help a man whom it was their duty to assist. They sat by and may even have given the wink to the murderer Zelensky to kill our good friend Gonzalo Lira. Elon Musk on Twitter, a very powerful man indeed, is now constantly highlighting the fact that Zelensky murdered an American journalist, Gonzalo Lira. Now, of course, we wish that everyone who is now preoccupied by this case had been at all preoccupied by it when it was still possible to save Gonzalo Lira's life. We were the people, and very few others, who beseeched the American government, the Chilean government, any government that could or would, to come to the rescue of this outstanding and brave figure. But nobody was listening then, but they are listening now. And so, posthumously, it may very well be that Gonzalo Lira features large, not as life, for he is dead, but large in the immediate future relations between the United States and the Ukraine. But first to Germany. Little soldier Scholz and Anna Baerbock, the foreign minister, could not have been closer to Zelensky. Well, they could have, I suppose, although we never know what goes on behind closed doors. But certainly, they embraced him with all of their hearts. And they've gone the way of so many others who have similarly embraced the deadly Zelensky in the last 3 years. The truth is that Baerbock and Scholz did more concretely, practically, to fuel this disastrous war, which has killed well over 1 million people, hundreds of thousands on the Russian side, 1 million and more on the Ukrainian side, and has cost all of us in treasure an uncountable amount of money. The dislocation that this war has caused in world affairs will be felt for 50, maybe 100 years from now. It is as cataclysmic in its way, in its impact on international relations than any event since the Second World War. It was the German Chancellor then, Angela Merkel, who guaranteed the Minsk II agreement, along with President Hollande, if you remember him, of France, if you remember them. Merkel and Hollande guaranteed that the Minsk II agreements would be implemented, but they both lied and have since admitted it. They have both admitted that Minsk II was a hoax, was a canard, it was a conspiracy against the peace. And as it's turned out, a conspiracy against the people of Germany and France, not to mention the Ukraine and Russia, and indeed more widely too. Merkel and Hollande, if they had been genuine, would have avoided having a war in the Ukraine at all. Minsk II committed the Ukrainian government to autonomy for the Russian-speaking regions of the country and no membership of NATO. Precisely the things that would have stopped this war, would have avoided the loss of at least 1/3 of Ukraine's territory, would have avoided the loss of at least 1.25 million people, would have avoided the wreckage of the economies of the belligerent NATO countries. The wreckage which came home to roost, though not as clearly as it should have, in the elections in Germany today. Since little Scholz came to power, he's been funneling money and weapons and diplomatic support and propaganda rhetoric and cracking down on the freedoms of the people of Germany like there was no tomorrow. But certainly tomorrow does not belong to him. He has plunged the SPD, the Labour Party equivalent, take note, Keir Starmer, in Germany to its lowest vote in the entire history of German democracy. Barely 15% of the electorate voted to re-elect their Prime Minister. It is an astounding low for a party that was once the natural party of government in the German Republic. This is the party of Willy Brandt. This is the party of Gerhard Schröder. This is the party which dominated post-war German politics for so long. And it has crashed and burned, and it has completely deserved to. To my astonishment, Baerbock's party actually did extremely badly, down almost 10%, but that 14% of the German electorate thought that Anna Baerbock was the answer. That greenery and quackery and wokery and the whole trans agenda was the answer for Germany in its dark hour. Well, frankly, that astounds me. But as I've been saying on here for quite some time, if you put both of these governing parties together, you don't get anywhere near 30% of the vote. And they are now out. Except that the party which has won the election, the CDU, the Conservative Party equivalent in Germany, is no better at all than the outgoing coalition of Scholz and Baerbock. Sound familiar? Sound familiar to you? This two cheeks of the same arse? This false dichotomy which is presented to voters in Britain, in France, in Germany, and other places in Western Europe too. Does it sound familiar that the only way you can kick out the incumbent government is to elect a government which is as bad, if not worse, than the outgoing coalition? And that is, of course, exactly what happened in Britain on the 4th of July last year. Nobody in their right mind could have voted to re-elect little Rishi Sunak, but the choice was him or Starmer, because the entire electoral process is completely rigged in Germany as in France. The German Nationalist Party, AfD, whose vote doubled in this election, but fell well short of being in the running for a coalition place, it was forgotten by the German state broadcaster in their final roundup on the eve of poll. Of the state of the parties, they forgot to mention the AfD, which doubled its vote and came in second in this election in Germany today. Sarah Wagenknecht, my own choice, if I had one, if I was a voter in Germany, was completely blanked out of the entire election. No debates, no television coverage, no national opinion poll mentioned her. And I've got my fingers crossed that she'll cross the 5% barrier and be in the new German parliament. The parade of transvestites called Die Linke got nearly 15% of the vote. So you can tell that there's still a lot of liberals in Germany. And those that are not liberals are not prepared to vote for anyone that will actually make a difference. And so the downward slide of the powerhouse of Europe, the most important country in Europe, continues and will continue. And as our guest from Germany, former candidate from Hamburg, told us, I think on Wednesday's show, if not last Sunday's, he told us, actually, they'll just all stay in government. None of them can govern on their own. Of course, the leader of the CDU, MOATS, a former BlackRock executive, yes, BlackRock, he'll be the chancellor, but Scholz and Baerbock will be back as junior partners in a new coalition. Before we had a traffic light coalition, now we have the Afghan flag. Work it out for yourselves. So Germany's crisis will continue unabated. Germany's warmongering will continue unabated. Germany's slide into complete irrelevance in world affairs will continue. And the economic wreckage and the multiple social crises that have accompanied it will, of course, also continue. So expect to see trouble in Germany ahead. Now, when Israeli Air Force dropped 80 tons of explosives on the head of the leader of the Lebanese resistance, Said Hassan Nasrallah, they probably hoped that that would be the end of the matter. When the resistance was forced by the Lebanese government, not that the Lebanese government could have forced them, but force majeure in that the resistance did not want to create a civil war in Lebanon, which they would have won and would have toppled the other powers in the state in an afternoon, but they have never and do not want to do that. So they agreed to a ceasefire. And in that ceasefire, during that ceasefire, which was broken by Israel more than 1,500 times and was broken again in South Lebanon today, we kept being told all the most educated fools in the Western polities and mass media that the resistance was over. They had been decapitated. They had been effectively disarmed, and that they were potentially so weak that they could be pushed out of Lebanese politics in total. Well, they didn't budget on 1.4 million Lebanese people turning up for Hassan Nasrallah's funeral in Beirut today. 1.4 million people in a country of less than 5 million people. That sounds like a pretty healthy share of the vote for the Lebanese resistance to me. This, despite the fact that there was every possibility that Israel could have dropped bombs on 1.4 million people. They flew fighter, bomber, aircraft over the funeral repeatedly and dropped bombs in the south of Lebanon as hundreds of international journalists were gathering for a funeral. But 1.4 million people turned out in support of the late leader of the Lebanese resistance. So I'm going to make a not all that bold prediction here. You have not heard the last of the resistance in Lebanon. That leaves me time only to deal with the latest lunacy of Sir Keir Starmer, who is doubling down on his conflict, not just with Putin, but now with Donald Trump. Trump has made clear Ukraine, what's left of it, at the end of this conflict, will never join NATO. But Keir Starmer says today, on the eve of his departure for a meeting with President Trump, that Ukraine will join NATO. He promised it, just like he promised £3 billion sterling every year for 100 years. Who does that? Who knows who's going to be running Ukraine 100 years from now? Who knows who's going to be running Britain? Who knows if either country will still exist in 100 years from now? But Starmer is very much more committed to Ukraine than he is to Britain. And I'm not entirely sure why that should be and why he's given such a free ride for being so. He cut the cold weather payments to our own old age pensioners in order to light up people in Ukraine. He took money from Britain's pensioners and gave it to Zelensky, even though the man and dog in the street knows that Zelensky and his circle are the greatest thieves of the 21st century. They keep getting caught. A low-level official in the Ministry of Defense in the Ukraine, nobody you've ever heard of, not near the top of the tree, was arrested this week with $14 million in cash. They spread it all out on the desk. Well, if that's what you're earning as a low-level official in the Ministry of Defense, just imagine the treasure in the chest of little Zelensky himself. All of that, much more, coming up. Stay tuned. It's the mother of all talk shows.